Thank you, Krista. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Just a brief overview of what we want to cover today. A little bit about why is knowledge management and innovation something to discuss, what is innovation, and how critical is KM to the success of innovation, both in the flow and above the flow of work. I want to share some selected findings from prior research, discuss next steps, and then, if possible, open the lines for an actual discussion with all of you. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to share today, a few thoughts crossed my mind. Why am I here talking to a knowledge management audience? I've been with APQC for about 14 years now, and the majority of my work has been around innovation and product development. But the reason I'm here talking to you today is that organizations are still struggling with getting knowledge to flow across barriers. And this is particularly painful in their innovation, R&D, or product development functions. And many of you on this call know this firsthand from your own organization. And this past May, at our Knowledge Management Conference, we had several companies sharing with us that this is an ongoing challenge that they're wrestling with. So here we are to discuss how can an organization really use knowledge management and embed it in the organization to improve innovation. But before we go any further, I'd like to thank Dr. Carla Odell, APQC President, for joining us today.
Thank you, Marisa. Of course, one of my loves is the whole issue of knowledge management, and this topic you've taken on could not be more timely. Our advanced working group in knowledge management has decided to take a very deep dive in the next 4 months into the question of how can KM and the KM program support an agile and innovative organization. So this is part of that conversation. Any of the advanced working group members who are on the line and on the computer with us today, welcome. Turn it back to you, Marisa.
Thanks, Carla. So before we go too much further, I want to discuss what I mean by innovation and how we want to use it during the rest of this conversation today. So from past APQC knowledge management research, we've talked about innovation as the embodiment, the combination, and or the synthesis of knowledge into new and unique combinations. But on the screen you'll see I included definitions from 2 companies that we've researched, where they talk about it's not just creative ideas, but it's those ideas becoming of value to the company. And it's not just working with others, but while in the course of developing a product. And I bolded those phrases because that's not much different at all from what we found in our innovation work, not working with knowledge management professionals. Innovation is not something that happens in an ivory tower, aside from a few pure research organizations or academic settings. But what we see in the multitude of companies that we work with and organizations around the world is about creativity and invention for a particular purpose, whether it's improving your top-line performance, growing your revenue through the development and creation of new products and new services, those things that you can put a dollar sign on and introduce into the market. But it's also about new ways of doing work that can result in that trifecta of faster, better, cheaper. That would be your improvement of the bottom line, really looking at how processes can be leaned out, how things can be done more efficiently and effectively. Another category of innovation that APQC has researched, and where I think knowledge management can be very useful, is business model innovation. And this is when organizations really change the way in which they go to market. So as an example, one of the companies that we have studied over the years is Kennametal. And they actually make metal cutting and construction equipment. So essentially they're a tool maker. But one of the things they realized is that the vast majority of the improvement from using their tools is not due to the tool itself, it's due to the knowledge of how to use it, the best way to apply it. So in one case, they went to a customer and offered to operate that customer's machining center for them. It essentially set up an outsourcing arrangement where they became a service provider, not just a widget maker, not just a tool manufacturer, but they guaranteed that customer a certain amount of year-over-year cost productivity improvement because Kennametal knew that they had designed the tools and they could use them better than anyone else. And the burden was then on Kennametal to exceed that promised amount of improvement because the difference was theirs to keep. So this model of really changing how they went to market from a provider of a tool to the provider of a service was definitely a business model change. And another category of innovation that is very important is the underlying enablers, the things that impact culture and the context. And this is, again, another area where KM can really play a role. KM embodies systematic approaches to help information and knowledge emerge and flow to the right people at the right time to create value. And I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir on that. You all know that. So when you look at solving the challenge of getting knowledge to flow in an R&D environment or in an innovative process, you really look at from person to person, but then you look at how new products are typically developed in the context of a project team. And these project teams are increasingly located in multiple locations around the world. So you've got different cross-functional representation on these teams, different geographic locations, often different languages, culture. How do you bring all these folks together and get knowledge to flow smoothly and seamlessly to add value to the organization? Also, products are usually developed in these product line silos or business units. In some companies, each business unit is as different from the next as they are from their competitors. So over time, how are organizations learning from their successes and failures in innovation and applying those lessons learned for the future? And what I have seen over time, and I just came back from doing some site visits this month looking at new product development processes in companies, is that the language of knowledge management is not familiar to those people who are in the trenches and trying to create innovative products and services and solutions. I never heard anybody say, we're really struggling to figure out who to staff on this project team to create this new product. We need an expertise locator system. I don't often hear people saying, we launched this new product in the market, we thought it was going to be the next great thing, and it failed miserably. Let's do a lessons learned after action review. They have their own vocabulary. And one of the things that I think would be really valuable is for KM to meet them sort of where they are, where they live, using their language. I don't hear them saying, let's have a best practice transfer and see what works. However, due to the nature of knowledge, all those approaches could be so useful and valuable. So I put in a picture here of the iceberg that we often talk about, the explicit knowledge being 20% and the bulk of it being this tacit knowledge. And you talk about higher competitive advantage. This is your innovative knowledge and work, which is harder to steal, harder to transfer. The payoff, the business case, if you will, for KM in this area is so amazingly great because of these unique challenges. For those of you who were at the May 2010 APQC Knowledge Management Conference, you had the opportunity to hear Carla O'Dell talking about above the flow or in the flow, the concept that knowledge is a flow, not a thing. So when you're doing KM, are you doing KM or are you doing the work of collaborative knowledge sharing and creating things? And so left to their own devices, as you're all probably well aware, people don't tend to collaborate very much in above-the-flow ways. But one of the things that we're looking at as organizations are emerging from the current business cycle and trying to do more with less, what gets lost or tossed? What is it that they're no longer doing that they don't have personnel anymore available to do, or that they tried to streamline or downsize or outsource? And as organizations continue to restructure and they have fewer employees, how are they capturing all this critical knowledge? So there's such a need for both in and above the flow knowledge management here. Organizations are increasingly doing post-launch reviews. They're not calling them after-action reviews, but they are stopping the flow of their work and looking 6 months to a year after a product was introduced in the market to see how it performed, to see what lessons they can learn. In the flow, we look at how using recycled materials can help lower your product development costs. The same is true for reusing knowledge. So we want to ask you, a little audience participation here. In your innovation or your R&D or your product development function, are you doing knowledge management above the flow or in the flow, both, or neither? So we have the poll open now. I'd like to invite all of you to share your answer with us so we can get a sense of what's going on in the organizations out there. This is one of the things that we've learned as we look at knowledge management, and we have about half of you all, 60% have already voted. So we're going to close the poll in just a minute. Okay, and 5, 4, 3. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So let's take a look at how the results shook out. 39% of you are doing knowledge management both above and in the flow, which is fantastic. But we see 26% doing only in the flow knowledge management when it comes to their innovation area. And then we have an equal amount that's not doing it at all and doing it above the flow.
Marisa, this is Carla. What's so interesting about this is only 18% say they're not doing knowledge management at all. So when we open the line in the R&D and the product development function, when you open the lines for discussion, we need to hear what they're doing.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carla. So the lessons that we learned in the last century, I mean, here we are in 2010, are still relevant today. And so many of you are aware of this from a KM perspective. If you build it, they won't necessarily come. And if they do come, they may not stay, they may not maintain. Change management still matters. These are all such important lessons. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and share some findings from APQC's past research related to both knowledge management and innovation. Back in 2002, we looked at how are organizations using KM to drive innovation. And I'm going to share just a few of the findings. And one of the things that we saw is that organizations are using KM to become more efficient innovators. We expected them to want more innovation, and they do, but the major focus is on efficient innovation. And 8 years later, this still rings true. Doing more with less. You know, sometimes the law of large numbers isn't necessarily the way you're going to be able to innovate. You can't just do as many projects as you can and hope that some of them stick. There's scarcity of resources. There's a need to really focus the organization. So the organizations are really trying to reuse knowledge and information and gain a higher yield from their innovation process. And this was all before the rise of social media and 2.0 technology. So if you just think what might be possible today, and you all are well aware that knowledge is sticky and won't move without a process. So boundary spanning is another key area where KM can help innovation. You look at things like expertise locator systems, and I did include here a link to a recent report we've published on this topic. All of our best practice reports are available in our knowledge base for our members to access at no cost, and non-members can purchase them as well. Just wanted to let everyone know that. And I think we have a question from someone. Erin?
We do. We have a question on the line asking, how is continuous improvement processes and tools separate or the same as innovation and KM?
Excellent question. So how is continuous process improvement different or the same than KM and innovation? Well, Carla, would you like to address it from a KM perspective?
Well, from a KM perspective, there's very synergistic, that the continuous process improvement tools are what you would use to get to root causes of problems, to understand what actually is the real cause, and to experiment with solutions. The way KM can support that is providing access to information about those experiments that they've been done before, access to people who know more about the potential causes, access to content around those causes, and so on. So that, and also then the opportunity to seek outside for more information about potential solutions, so that you're not just making it all up yourself, but you actually have the opportunity to benchmark. So there APQC is all about process improvement and knowledge. So for us, it's a highly synergistic relationship.
Thank you, Carla. So one of the things that we see when you look at the culture and the context, when you look at innovation in a scientific or a technical setting, the nature of the work and the nature of the professionals makes it even more important to look at how knowledge management can help and to consider the way in which it can work. Because you've got people who are used to being inventors, not necessarily recyclers. There's the whole not invented here syndrome that has to be overcome. One company we studied came up with a PFE award, the Proudly Found Elsewhere award, to really encourage reuse and to get people away from this idea that if I didn't come up with it, it can't possibly be good. And KM really does help with all these different ways in addressing the bias against reuse, etc. Two other studies that we undertook were looking at innovation and putting ideas into action. So here we were looking at it from an innovation approach, not from a knowledge management approach. And one of the companies we studied, Procter & Gamble, actually is using communities of practice in support of innovation. They have a community of practice for their technology entrepreneurs, 50 worldwide experts, if you will. And they fund them half from the business units, half from the corporate level. And they are there to really look at how internal needs can be connected with possible solutions from outside the company. This is one of the few times that I actually heard official community of practice language used by people in support of innovation. Which is not to say that there aren't many companies out there that have definitely embraced KM in innovation. And some of you all may be on the call with us today. But by and large, the language isn't being spoken, if you will, inside this function. I put this quotation up here on the screen because I think it's very insightful. This is from Larry Houston, who used to be at Procter & Gamble. And he was talking about innovation inside the company. And he says, you're not managing know-how. You're managing know-who. Know-how was last century. And this is very true in P&G, particularly as they look to connect and develop as opposed to research and develop new products and services. Erin, do we have another question from someone?
We do. We have a question asking, a lot of innovation can come from people in the trench or frontline workers. How can you change a company's focus to encourage all employees to put ideas forward?
Excellent, excellent question. So one of the main things that innovation looks at and innovation processes in a lot of companies look at is how do you capture ideas that are generated from all employees and also from external alliances, collaborations, and just outside sources. There are a lot of technology solutions that are available, but there's also a process of making sure that those ideas are all captured and that somebody is charged with analyzing that information. Because you all know that if you just took all those ideas and put them into a repository, they would probably sit there and get very dusty. But we've seen organizations like IBM and others who have a process for taking those ideas and routing them around to the people who need to see them, and also enabling others to build on ideas to really start looking to see if you're hearing the same thing from 20 employees in 20 different locations who are all interacting with customers. That's very valuable information. And there are definitely processes to take those ideas and turn them into action. One of the things where we see sometimes the ideas don't work. Products and services are introduced or they're starting to be introduced and they fail. And one of the things that is so interesting is what do organizations do with all the lessons that they've learned from those failures? Again, here's an opportunity for KM to really come in and connect the dots on this. And one of the things that Mayo Clinic has done is they have an award called the Queasy Eagle. And because they want to reward people trying. Knowing that there will be some failure, they want to reward the effort. And so if they try and fail, they have this wonderful Queasy Eagle Award. So looking at how KM could really help in terms of selecting which innovation projects the organization should undertake, I've again pulled something from Procter & Gamble. So before their innovation people undertake any new project, they first ask them, does this already exist inside Procter & Gamble, maybe in another business unit? And if they can't say yes to that, then they have to look to see if the company's suppliers might have it. If not, does it exist somewhere else in the world? And if no to all of the above, then invent it yourself. But my question is, how can you answer those if you don't have some kind of knowledge management going on to be able to look at what else exists inside the company across business units with your suppliers and so forth. So the business case, again, for me, is pretty clear. Another study that APQC undertook in 2007 was on improving collaboration in product and service development. And we see that organizations are definitely taking steps to build centralized guidelines for this and allowing flexibility at the local level for individuals who are developing new products and services. There's also a lot of training that goes on during and between projects. Again, another opportunity for knowledge management approaches and knowledge sharing to be a part of this. We talk about boundaryless collaboration because of the global nature of so many organizations today, and figuring out how project team members can communicate. So I put in here a graphic from Intel, one of the companies that we studied, and this is fairly typical in that R&D employees, product development employees, are typically permanently assigned to a functional organization. Maybe they're a mechanical engineer and they're part of the mechanical engineering group. But then they're assigned to work on a program or a project until it's completed. Often they're staffed on multiple projects or multiple programs at the same time. One finishes and they roll on to the next. There's so much knowledge that's gained in the course of those programs and projects. How does that get fed back to their home functional organization? And understanding the tools and technologies. As we learned in the study we did on the role of evolving technologies, there's so much now that organizations can be doing. But I still can tell you a vast amount of collaboration is happening over email, and the knowledge isn't really being captured. So again, making sure that they're working with the IT organization and the KM group to really help them improve that. So I'm going to pause there and address a couple of the questions that have been posed from some of our attendees. Erin?
Okay, so we have one question from someone who works at a consulting firm that has developed a CAM program, and they've been running it successfully in 2002. One of their biggest problems is that people understand that sharing knowledge is important and that as they put their knowledge on the table, they don't lose value in the company.
That's a very fundamental question that I think we deal with all the time.
Marisa, this is Carla. It is fun. I think getting people engaged and participating, whatever that means, is probably the holy grail of any change program, any improvement program, and it certainly is a KN as well. So lots of ways to deal with that, but some sort of underlying principles. Number one is, especially with consultants or anybody who's assigned a project where utilization is a key thing, they're not being paid to stop and share. They're being paid to deliver. The client is asking them to pay and deliver. So with integrity of the client, most of the time, if you talk about taking people, quote unquote, out of the flow to capture what they know or what they just discovered or what might be useful to other people, anything that requires busy people to do something different is probably either doomed to failure, or you're going to need a large team in India working on capturing the content from those folks. So the other way to do it, which has become more possible with in two ways, with the advent of new technologies and 2.0 technologies, is to be able to encourage them to, one, get out of email, and to two, to more of their project work in collaboration spaces, which by definition is going to capture some of what's going on there. And then rather than trying to package it in advance in the anticipation that somebody might eventually need that particular nugget, you don't try to spend as much time on capture and collect as you do on connect. So your ability to enable a search function that would uncover that at the time someone needed it. So just enough, just in time, just for me, is when people want stuff. It's like cleaning the Aegean stable to try to, capture all this content people create. We create too much of it, and most of it's not any use anyway. But when somebody needs it, they need it. So that doesn't mean there's not a role for that team behind the scenes and above the flow who's extracting, especially from consulting projects where there's intellectual property issues, legal issues, extracting key content for the professionals and then asking the professionals if you can get their attention for 3 minutes, is this the best stuff you got? And is this what we should be doing? The other way consulting firms do it, and I'm sure our questioner knows this, is that they'll take people out of practice for a while and put them on the bench to do that, so that this extraction work and packaging is being done by people who know the work and not a team of people who are basically performing a librarian or editor function. So those are just a couple of principles that apply here, because it's not going to, any system, this is my rule of thumb, any system that's built on asking busy people, expert or otherwise, to stop what they're doing and do something for you is doomed to failure unless you've got a lot of money to pay them to do it.
Thanks, Carla.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we have another question that goes back to the quote about you're not managing know-how, you're managing know-who. And it says, with a crew change looming, if the ones to know leave, will this send us back to a know-how environment, and how do we prepare for this?
Yeah, and I think we've looked at that both from the perspective of the know-how in terms of some of our innovation work we've done. And this is where we've seen the rise of organizations like Innocentive and Nine Sigma and other organizations that are seeking to connect on a global scale individuals who might have answers to the challenges that companies are facing because they don't have the expertise resident in-house in some cases. But also we're seeing companies rehiring retirees and also trying to capture some of their knowledge before they leave. And this is something that I know we've looked at retaining valuable knowledge inside organizations from a KM perspective, but it's definitely something that organizations are addressing already in some cases by either rehiring their retirees, repurposing them, trying to make sure that they retain the critical know-how if they need it, or outsourcing that which is no longer core to the enterprise.
Okay, and we have one more question that says, in an R&D environment where one's value is determined by what one knows, not if they share knowledge, where and how do you start to change that culture?
Yes, that's if I had the answer to that, I think we'd be on a beach somewhere. But yeah, the challenge at some point comes down to incentives. If the person's being measured and incented to hoard their knowledge because that gives them esteem and that gives them status in the organization, and that's the behavior you're going to get. So what we see is that organizations are making an explicit part of experts and some of these technical leads. It's an explicit part of their objectives now that they mentor others and that they participate in some of these knowledge sharing activities. And this is where putting it in the flow as opposed to above the flow can be helpful, so that they aren't feeling like they're doing their technical wizardry and then they have to stop and suddenly share it. So partnering them to do on-the-job mentoring and training with newer employees or younger employees so that it's happening in the course of the project can make it more palatable for those individuals, while making sure that the incentives are there for them to participate and providing rewards. And rewards take different forms for different kinds of employees, too. So if technical people aren't motivated by the financial reward, which is sometimes the case, we see organizations that are looking to reward them in a way that works best for that kind of a role.
And we have another question on the topic of failure. So failure is recognized as a common outcome of innovation cycles, and so there's a two-part question. Number one, how do you make senior managers and project managers comfortable with failure? And number two, how do you get team members to trust that failures will not be punished? These are identified as common requirements, but good practices don't seem to be readily available.
True. And we're seeing that in the study we're doing right now, Erin, on how do organizations embrace an adaptable and flexible product development process, yet ensure that it's still very rigorous. So the comfortable with failure part of it, and I think that there's a lot of risk management research that's being done and figuring out how you get organizations comfortable with risk. But from my perspective, and I'll address it from an R&D perspective, looking at your product development and innovation work in a portfolio. so that not all your eggs are in one basket, and not all your projects that you're taking on are these high-risk projects, that you've got some that are your line extensions, your next new flavor, tweaks of your existing products that should be very low risk. And then you've got some that are in the middle that are, more growth projects. And then you've got some that can be this much more disruptive, breakthrough, radical, very risky projects. And figuring out how you resource and staff so that you aren't putting everything on these risky projects, and also identifying those risks up front, early on in the feasibility stage, so that you can start to mitigate them or have a plan to address them. And as knowledge continues to be gained over the course of the project, moving through the various stages of development, your assumptions should start to get more and more concrete, and you should be able to then hopefully figure out how you're going to address the various risks involved in the project. Carly, did you want to add something on that?
I thought what you said is really powerful, Marisa. It's so good to have this cross-disciplinary perspective on this. I mean, that's where innovation comes at the boundaries and the edges. But I think this is a really important question, and it's a cultural question more than it is anything else. And of course, we all think, okay, culture. But there's two kinds of ways you can fail. You can fail because you tried to do something and you did it the right way, but the results were not what we would maybe want. And that would be you followed a rigorous process, you used all the knowledge that the firm already had, you didn't repeat old mistakes, but still the market didn't like it. That happens. That's the kind of failure. That's what you get a queasy eagle for. That's what people ought to feel good about, because then you can ask the question, what did we learn? Because there's always something there to learn. The second case, when it turns out to be a quote-unquote failure because we used sloppy processes, we acted like we had corporate amnesia and didn't know what we already knew about how to do this, we redid a bunch of work that cost a bunch of money. That's a different kind of failure, and boy, the lessons learned on that are equally as powerful. And you got to be careful in the early days of trying to create the culture where failure is used as a learning opportunity, that you don't kill people the first few times they do that, but they shouldn't do that more than once. And it needs to be clear that, this is how we have enabled you to learn from the past, and people are going to help you. Please don't do that again. There's two different approaches. One is to do it right and it didn't turn out so well. The other is to do it sloppy and didn't turn out so well.
Very true, Carla. And the reality is, if you're not failing, you're probably not taking enough risk at some level. You're sandbagging, you're playing it too safe. And if you look at jumping to the next curve, if you will, you're not going to get there by only coming out with safe new products and services. So,
such a great point.
Erin, do we have another question?
Not yet.
Okay. Please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A function on the software that we're using today. And then we're going to go ahead and unmute all the lines because we would like to be able to have a live discussion with you all. And I will put the caveat out there that after we unmute it, if for some reason it's too noisy, we'll mute the lines again and just ask you to use the hand-raising feature in the GoToMeeting software.
And then we'll unmute you so you can ask.
Yes. Okay, everyone, our lines are now unmuted, and so this is the actual live audience participation segment of our call. We encourage you to ask any questions you might have related to knowledge management and the application within innovation. And perhaps what we could do is ask some of you, particularly those of you on the poll who said you're not doing KM above or in the flow of innovation, to describe some of the KM approaches that you are using.
And those who are using them, yeah.
And those of you who are using KM, please describe what you're using. And if you have placed your own line on mute, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself at this point.
I noticed in the polls that there was well over, well, it was actually almost 80% of the people were doing it, had seen it. They weren't either doing it. You may not be doing it yourself, but you're seeing in your R&D function and your new product development function, some use of knowledge management.
Do you have a question from someone on the line? Okay. We're hearing some noise. We're going to go ahead and mute the lines again and ask your questions in the Q&A chat, please, online. Erin, do we have another question?
We do. Do you know of any companies that are using point programs similar to loyalty programs to encourage knowledge sharing?
Yeah, in IBM, one of the ways they measure the effectiveness of the user-contributed content in their practitioners portal, this is in IBM Global Business Services, is that employees who are contributing content and who have highly rated content, often downloaded content, get points for doing that. So you get a various number of points, and it's not just for, contribute as much as you can, because loading a bunch of stuff is not actually the end game we're after here, but the number of people who rate it highly. So those point programs, and I can't remember what they get as a result besides bragging rights, which they do get bragging rights. They get elevated to a kind of a higher stature inside that community.
I know with one of them they do something where you get meeting FaceTime with senior execs. So the highest people in a month get to meet with somebody who's a leader in their area, and they get FaceTime that they ordinarily wouldn't get.
Yeah, because it's all virtual. Their work is all virtual. Yeah, you're right. I heard that. So that's one I can think of. Anybody else have any others on the line?
So, Darcy?
Well, actually, hello, everybody. This is Darcy. I don't know if they still do this, but at Rockwell Collins, one thing they used to do, and it wasn't so much points, like you couldn't look up your name and see that you had 110 points or something like that, but it was a status thing. So as you contributed quality content, and the quality was judged by the end users who would be downloading and reusing your content, so they had a rating system. The more that you contributed and your stuff was reused, the higher status, and it was something like, so you would start off, let's say, as an apprentice, right, and they had a little apprentice icon that would go next to your name. And so the more that you contributed, either content or to discussion forums or what have you, then you can move up the ladder, so to speak, and you could become like a journeyman and then a master, and then it was like a wizard or something like that. And I apologize to anybody from Rockwell Collins who might be on the line that if I'm getting this incorrect, but that's one that I found highly intriguing because it didn't rely explicitly on points per se, as I said, and there wasn't a reward in terms of if I gathered so many points or I got to a certain status level, I got a meeting with someone, but it was more about the recognition of the fact that I am a contributor. People see me as having a lot of experience and or expertise in this particular area. So, I'm a recognized peer amongst my peers.
That's great. Thanks, Darcy. Glad you could join us.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions. So how about, in knowledge sharing, there are often generational communication issues. Can you comment on how companies are solving communication barriers? For example, more mature folks that won't text or contribute to a wiki, and younger folks that won't talk to people face to face.
So this is Darcy again, and I would say, first off, let me just put it bluntly, there is no magic solution to that, okay? It's a matter of communication and connection, and both sides understanding that there are benefits to the different ways we connect and communicate with each other. And really the only way to do that is for them to be willing to reach out to each other and be a little open-minded, and that really falls on some of us having, setting ourselves up as role models and behavior models for what we want to see. So finding those people who use multiple means of communication. They will post a question in a discussion forum. They IM. They walk next door or take an elevator up to the next floor and talk to somebody. Those are the kinds of things that you want to encourage, and it doesn't matter what generation you are. There's also a question of it's not just a generation issues. We were having a discussion in a group last week. There are stage of life issues that go on here too, and the way we prefer to communicate and work and talk and things like that may vary as we go through different stages of life. So those of us who might not be so open-minded about some ways of communicating right now might find as we move through the phases of our life and get more experience with our work and become, maybe get, higher status in our organization, our ways of working and communication change because of the demands on our time, both from a personal and a work obligation, kind of force us into different means of communication. But really, it's a matter of reaching out to both sides and showing the benefits from both and finding those role models who exhibit those right behaviors and putting them in front of others.
Thanks, Darcy.
So we have a lot of questions, so we just want to reiterate one more time. If any of you have examples you'd like to share from the poll we did regarding how you're using KM in innovation and R&D, please send us a chat message or a question, and then we'll figure out how to unmute you so that you can tell us what you're doing so that we can hear from some of you. In the meantime, I'll read a couple of other questions. So another question we got is, what are some best practices directed at tapping knowledge from newly hired staff?
Well, that's interesting.
Getting a fresh set of eyes to look at the process. Well, I can tell you that in a lot of companies, in fact, almost all the ones that we've recently been site visiting, their product development process is part of their is included in their new hire orientation. So they expose all their new hires to it, and a lot of them give them an opportunity then, give the new hires an opportunity to share some reactions to it, insights, lessons, that they might have gleaned from other organizations.
The other thing, sometimes new hires are very experienced employees too, so having some kind of profiling or social networking capability inside your organization where they can share what they've done in the past, if you're working in a more virtual environment. If you're working in a face-to-face environment, the onboarding process for human beings is really important to have that personal touch and to have an opportunity for a person, even if they haven't been working long, to share what we call accomplishments and aspirations. What were the 2 best projects you ever worked on in your life and why? And what is it you really want to be or do next and learn? And people just resonate to each other. Everybody can answer the questions, and people love to hear that from other people, and it causes you to respond with a very generous desire to help. So that's a nice little technique.
If I could add, I agree both with Marisa and Carla's points and examples. From a knowledge sharing perspective, similar to what Marisa said about product development and building that into the new hire orientation so that they're involved and aware from day one, right? What we've seen at organizations with very successful KM programs is that they do something similar where the information on how to collaborate and how to share is part of that orientation process for the new hire. So awareness about what communities they might be interested in, depending on their role and their interests within the organization. What are the tools and capabilities that the organization has in their IT suite that will enable them to do that? And then, ensuring in some way, shape, or form that not only do they get this in the orientation process, but that if I'm a new hire coming in and maybe there's a new hire community of practice, or there's a community of practice that's around the role I will be performing within the organization, making sure I understand how to become a member. Is it a matter of finding a SharePoint site and requesting it through the SharePoint site? Is there an individual I need to reach out to? What's the process, and making that just as clear as day for me. And then I would hope, too, that there would be individuals within the organization, whether it's a mentor for that new hire or whomever that would encourage that and kind of nudge or push that person. So there's kind of the push and the pull to ensure that they're introduced to the right groups and the IT to enable them to do that sharing.
I tell you, Darcy, that's so important because that first 6 months of someone's life in an organization, it colors how they feel about it and whether they stay. And we have such a shortage of scientists and engineers now. You can't afford to, let anybody drift away because you didn't nurture them in the early days. Those are great examples.
Okay, so how about a question? Open innovation is a popular approach. What would be the equivalent approach in KM, and what would open KM look like?
So in terms of open innovation, I would assume that they're asking about really looking anywhere in the world to find the answer to the challenges that they're wrestling with. So it doesn't have to be something that you created in your own laboratory. You might acquire it from a company, and I'll give you a great example. One of the firms we studied was developing a spinning toothbrush. One of these electric toothbrushes, you push the button and it spins for you. They looked at a children's lollipop where you push the button and the lollipop spins, and they were able to adapt that technique and use it in their toothbrush, and it was a fraction of the cost that these other electronic toothbrushes had been in the past. So open innovation is really about still protecting your intellectual property, but opening the kimono a little bit and looking broadly. And organizations that I mentioned earlier, like Nine Sigma and some of those, what they'll help you do is state your problem in the fundamental scientific language that applies to it. So for example, say you want to have a disposable diaper that can be flushed away. So you need something that can hold liquid in and yet dissolves in water. So you would state it as a fundamental scientific problem, put it out to this giant network of people around the world, and see what you get back. I know that in one example, P&G was looking for a way to put designs on Pringles, on the potato chips, like, Mr. Incredible and some of those folks who've shown up on chips. They got a solution from a bakery far away somewhere that had been doing something like that. Like in another country, it completely would not have entered their radar screen if they hadn't cast the net wide. So that's sort of the open innovation approach. I'll turn it over to my KM colleagues for some ideas on what open KM might look like.
Well, I actually think open innovation is open KM. It is boundarylessness, and at work, which is a terrible word. Somebody's going to come up with a different alternative, but it says that we're going to look outside the boundaries for knowledge, and we're going to do it in a smart way. So we don't tell you the products we're developing. We're just telling you the scientific problem that we're facing. So I think it is an example of that. And the interesting thing is, what happens inside the organization after that idea comes in? Is there a team inside that is set up to evaluate that new knowledge and so on? So that's the interesting thing, because you can get a lot of great ideas. We're just swimming in great ideas internally and externally. The question is, do we know how to use them?
And I just find it fascinating. Over the years, I've heard in the KM world, and I'm speaking as an outsider looking in, that you've moved in some cases from having a core team to really kind of getting embedded more in the business units. And what we see in innovation is companies are still maintaining a small centralized core to handle things like, when you look outside, technology scouting, technology brokering, they're keeping a group that's really charged with that, because if the other groups are being funded by the business units, they're going to be looking at what that business unit is focused on. But if you think of the organization chart, there's a lot of white space between the boxes, and somebody needs to be looking between the boxes. And so having this central group that is charged with that, with looking at, children's lollipops and how can we apply that to a toothbrush, someone has to be thinking outside the box, to use the overused phrase.
Well, and I think you're right about that. You've got to maintain some central core. For example, a central core KM program may consist of 4 people, but they will convene a meeting of all the community of practice leaders and knowledge managers from across the organization and all those different disciplines. And when they get together, they're going to share in an open way what are some of the innovations they've seen happen in their groups, either from a KM process perspective or from the real content of it. and that's another vehicle for crossing those boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can throw out there, going back to the OpenKM topic a moment ago, APQC did some research on that a couple of years ago. I believe it was the report was called something like Leveraging Knowledge Across the Value Chain. So for those of you who are on the line and have already or have access to our knowledge base, I encourage you to go in and look for it in there. For those of you who may not have been to our knowledge base, this might be an opportunity to explore. But we studied 5 different organizations and how they were crossing those white spaces within their organizations and within their org charts, but also how they were reaching outside their organizations and going to their business partners and suppliers and customers and just the extended stakeholders for the organization and involving them. And one of the things that we uncovered was that a lot of what was holding people back was fear. And it was fear around, you know, what if we share something we're not supposed to, and therefore somebody gets some IP from us they're not supposed to, and you know, so the organizations that we studied had found some unique and creative ways to get around that, and but it was very elegantly simple at the same time. I mean, it was basically lining out, okay, these are the things that we can talk about across our boundary wall. These are the things that, for whatever reason, we cannot. Once we have a clear understanding of that, we can have this conversation. They use some pretty simple tools, you know, non-disclosure agreements and memorandums of understanding and things like that, and you know, laying out the ground rules and setting expectations, which is something that's, you know, a pretty basic, some pretty basic tools for project management and team building work in that environment as well. And so, you know, it's a matter of understanding and getting past some of that initial queasiness in your stomach that you might feel when you think about sharing across organizational or outside organizational walls.
Thanks, Darcy. We have time for about 2 more questions, perhaps. Erin?
Okay. Creating in the flow KM seems like it would require intimate knowledge of processes. So how can KM professionals get such an intimate knowledge without making the frontline workers in the innovation and R&D space feel invaded?
Ooh.
Hi, I'm from corporate. I'm here to help.
Yeah. That's a really good, actually, that's one of the things the Advanced Working Group is going to be looking at, because before you can answer the question, how can KM enable innovation, you have to do what Marisa has done with your own people and say, here's, what gaps are you guys experiencing? And because the languages of the 2 communities may be different, the KM community and the innovation or R&D community, you got to just go live with them for a while. So they don't have to try to express it or so on. You just need to kind of, is it okay if I hang out and see if there's anything we can do here? And here's the kind of things I'm looking for, and you know, and so you can do some of it through interview, but some of it may just be shoulder-to-shoulder design, like you would for any good product.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm reminded of something that just one of my favorite site visit moments. We were at Clorox, and they have a product called the bath wand. It's a long stick that you can, at the end is the cleaning part. And they said, you know how we created this? We actually went to people's homes and watched them cleaning their bathtubs. And they said nobody wanted to have to climb in the tub and get wet and get dirty, and they were kind of disgusted by the whole process. And they said we wanted to give them the ability to clean it from a distance. And then when they were done, and the same holds true for their toilet wand, they could dispose of that thing and not ever have to touch it again, instead of having it sitting next to their toilet all the time, you know, and
Like your grandmother did.
Exactly. And so it was by ethnographic research and by living with their customers that they were able to figure out how to solve their customers' unarticulated problems. And I think that's part of it. In product development, we always talk about the unarticulated customer need and what job are they really trying to accomplish with your product. And I think almost applying some of those principles in voice of customer and all that to applying KM to product development, I think, can be very valuable.
And to any change management activity.
Absolutely.
You know. People change for their reasons, not your reasons. And they share knowledge for their reasons, not your reasons.
Yeah.
It's a great example.
Okay, so one last question, and we will go with
Drum roll, please.
Are there any tips, tools or techniques for us to get our overflowing workload done sooner without diminishing quality, so that we can spend more time doing in-the-flow and above-the-flow knowledge-sharing activities? Technology has made us more efficient, but the demand for work and the pace increases continuously. So I think really what this question may be more about is how do you create a culture where it's okay to set aside time to be able to do these things and balance that with the work that you have to do to keep the company and your department moving?
As far as the overflowing workload, I would say that if you're coming from a product development perspective, what we're seeing organizations do is look at their new product development process, because that's really sort of what they live and die by, the process by which they create new products, and step back and say, does every project have to go through the full process, or can we scale this? Can we combine some steps, skip some steps, so that we don't always do things the way we've always done them just because that's how we did them, and really be a little more thoughtful about the work process that you have to go through so that you can cut out non-value-added steps. The principles of lean are very helpful in that case as well, and trying to get the waste out of the system. So that would be sort of an approach that we look at.
Well, as somebody sent me an email at 9:30 last night when I was working on stuff, yesterday was Information Overload Awareness Day.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And there's a little website for a company-sponsored little conference, an online conference where you can do that. I am not a good practitioner, but I'm afraid that given how rich our lives are with opportunities and the work that needs to be done is often self-generated, as Marisa said, because there's so much we could learn from, that this question of focus and priority, do not look at me as a role model, but to really use some of the tools that have been out there a while, from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, et cetera. But you've got to do it, as Marisa said, you have to do it as a group. We have to all collectively decide we can eliminate this non-value added activity. You can't just unilaterally say, I will no longer do this for you.
And prioritizing and the whole portfolio management approach, again, there are going to be the big things that you must do, but then, scaling the amount of resources you invest in things based on the return you hope to achieve from them is not a bad idea in some cases. Well, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today on the call, and I'd like to thank Carla, Darcy, Erin, and Krista for being here with us as well. And in light of the conversation we had, I can tell you that we firmly believe that nothing can replace face-to-face interaction. As great as it is to talk with you on the phone, we'd love to actually see you. So we'd like to invite all of you to come to Houston. It's lovely in November. We're having our annual member meeting next month, and there's some training that happens beforehand, and then we'll have some fascinating presentations throughout the day. And some of them will focus on things we, APQC, have learned from the research that we've conducted recently, and some of it will be shared from practitioners and others who are in the trenches, if you will. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.